And here we go. Hello, and welcome to the Smart Money Simplified podcast with Brent Mekosh. Brent, you've got quite a crowd joining us today.
We do have quite a crowd. We've got several panelists that I'll introduce here shortly, but the topic is an important one. So my friend Geoff, I've had him on in the past to talk about this issue of trust. It's definitely something that I think is hugely important. I mean, obviously, I turned on the news this morning, and at least just around politics, we've got all the associated stuff with the Biden family. We've got the indictment of Donald Trump. So you've got it happening now on both sides of the aisle. You look at people's trust of the media at an all-time low, people's trust of corporations at an all-time low. And a lot of these large institutions and in society in general, all of this stuff that we're doing is undermined by the fact that we've got to kind of trust the people that we are working with. We have to trust the institutions that we're working with. And I would say, at least in the Western world, I can't speak as much to other parts of the world, but I think the trust in a lot of these institutions that have been really pivotal and really critical in terms of keeping our society together are at an all-time low. And Geoff is an expert on this as well. He's actually written a book on this. He's going to be joined today by Douglas Lines and Karen Jones, who also have a great deal to say about this topic. And I'm just looking forward to diving into it because I think it's something that if we're going to get back on track as a society, we've got to rebuild, at least begin the process of halting this decline in trust that we've had over the last several years, but also rebuild trust to the levels where it's going to hopefully move the ball forward. So, Geoff, is that a fair assessment? Is that a good intro to what we're going to talk about today?
Yeah, I think it's a great intro, and look, you made some very valid points on and around geopolitical issues, but I think what we're missing here that look. Number one, this is what I would call like the new normal era because it's so complex and so dysfunctional right now. I think leaders in every area of politics, in business, and actually leaders. If you remember the last podcast we had, I talked about leadership at home and what that represents. I think that we are facing unprecedented times. I think that. We've got to constantly relook and revisit the organization that we represent. We've got Russia, blowing up Ukraine, and we've got Ukraine blowing up Russia now. From a geopolitical point of view, we've got the energy crisis. We've got increased interest rates. We have business supply chain issues. We have zero data trust issues. We have divorce rates at the highest. I think it's 1 in 2 now. Sad to say this, but 1 in 2 divorces are taking place. This is an actual behavioral shift, which is causing trust to come into a decline. Number one. I think number two, we've got to get back to what I call the foundation of trust, and I'm deeply honored to know that I have both Douglas Lines here today and also Karen Jones, because I think some of the solutions of what we're talking about, whilst trust is an active behavior and it's an output behavior, some of the most intricacies that we need to talk about is very much driven by Douglas and Karen with their specialist expert fields.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. So Karen and Douglas, could you give us an intro and yourself in terms of how you got interested in this topic and what your connection is with Geoff? So Karen, I guess we'll start with you.
I do what I do because we're all at work more than we're anywhere else generally. So I have a passion for how do we manage the culture and the climate that enables people to turn up to work at their best, with their best selves. And I think what I hear time and again is that most people want to do that, but there's a whole load of interference that gets in the way. So I work with clients to diagnose their organizational culture and to begin to look at the climate that leadership teams are creating.
And what do you see when you're coming into an organization? Are we talking, what size organizations are we talking about?
They can be small SMEs of 50, or they can be global companies of 15,000. So it doesn't really matter the size of them. It's a much harder, complex process to change the larger the companies, but the issues are generic across all of them.
Yeah, let's talk about some of those, because I think human nature's pretty consistent across the board, and that obviously applies to organizations as you put more and more human beings together. But if you had to point out a couple really significant issues that you see, regardless of the size of the organization, that are happening, that are impacting employees and the public's perception of trust of those institutions, what would that be? What are the big red flags that you consistently see?
I would say vulnerability and openness. I think we have a terror of sharing truth. And I think that starts with leadership teams and with individuals within a leadership team. Somehow we seem to spend an awful lot of energy hiding what we really believe and assume to be true.
And give me an example of that, where you've seen something like that happening.
I see it on when we diagnose organizational culture, we split the data into hierarchy and level, and we'll have the leadership team saying, yes, we're absolutely crystal clear on the strategy or the vision, and then their next direct reports are saying, I'm absolutely not. Now, it might mean that I'm clear about it and I don't like it, or it might mean that you never communicate it with me. And for me, I really don't understand why very senior leaders believe that actually it's up to them entirely by themselves to write the strategy and then maybe or maybe not share it with the people who are trying to implement it for them.
And is that something that you're still seeing where, obviously the people that are closest to whatever the issue is on the ground I don't want to say at the bottom of the hierarchy, but the people that are most connected to the day-to-day operation of those businesses, are we still in a place, at least in the business world, where their input is not being considered by those at the top?
Yeah, I was doing a debrief with a client yesterday, and the HR director was saying that they can only get 20 minutes from the CEO. It's fast. Right. We're fast. And you just think, wow, if you're investing in a cultural diagnostic, but you can only get 20 minutes from the CEO to even talk about it, that to me is rather worrying.
Yeah, I can understand why that would be, for sure. Now Douglas, what's your connection with these two?
Well, it's good connections, Brent, and always wonderful to be here with you and your listeners. And I'm Geoff's business partner in London. And also, Karen and I and Geoff met some time ago at a thought leadership event, actually our thought leadership event in the City of London. And so, definitely aligned between Karen and myself and Geoff in terms of our views on trust and, more importantly, even culture. And from my side, I've really been privileged to look after some very senior people in politics, in institutions, et cetera, et cetera. So from small businesses all the way through to presidents, I've had exposure to and looked after over many periods of time. And I think the learnings for me is that where you have trusted leadership as a bedrock in terms of skills and attributes that a leadership team aspires to, you see, longer term sustainable performance. So I am enormously passionate about executive leadership and what are the skills and attributes of executive leaders and their teams going forward. And I'm a big fan of the amount of effort that we spend on strategy. You should be spending a similar amount. Yeah. And I think what Karen was saying in terms of CEO spending 20 minutes in culture is, to me, a dismissible offense, quite frankly. That's just ridiculous. So and we see it often. We see it often in the companies that we engage with, is very little emphasis on culture in many respects. Looking at Geoff's view of the world now in terms of the operating environment, we actually see a survivalistic mentality in business out there, and you couple that with the strain of mental health and all the pressures, and it's actually given rise to in some cases toxic leadership, which is clearly the worst environment that you could face. So it is something which I think we've all got to strive to make a difference in whatever we choose to and whoever we engage with. But it is a real need out there in business right now. The other thing I think is, what Geoff and I are passionate about is technology. But, I was just saying the other day to Geoff is that if I remember when we were kids growing up and the pressures we had with technology was actually minimal, versus now, and the generations that are coming through and the expectations of life. It is really, this technology accelerating everything in life, the pace of everything that we do. So yeah, I think it goes to the heart of sustainability, whether it's in communities, whether it's in families, as Geoff rightly pointed out, in terms of the high divorce rate. And sometimes we forget these things in the busyness and the hecticness of life.
Now, I guess I'll pose this question to all of you. I think that any institution, in order for it to be resilient down to the family level, all the way up to large institutions, there has to be a level of trust from all the participants. Douglas, you mentioned this idea of toxic leadership, and I agree with you. I think that what we've seen, I can speak at least to U.S. politics, for example, is the pivotal people. I'm 50, but when I started getting interested in politics was in the 1980s. The pivotal people were Ronald Reagan, president, and Tip O'Neill, who was Speaker of the House. Two opposing parties. They would have a beer together every single Friday. It was my friend on the other side of the aisle who was wrong on this issue, but it wasn't the opposition, if you want to put it that way, or those that might not agree with you. They weren't the Antichrist. They were just people that you had disagreements with. And so this idea of toxic leadership, I'd like to hear from all of you in terms of, when that really started, because I'm sure that it's always been the case where it has been out there.
Can I jump in here? Because
Yes,
I'm really,
please.
I'm really passionate about this subject. And look, I think both Karen and Doug have said some incredible things about their respective specialist areas and fields of work. What we are seeing is an increase in mental health. Actually, United Airlines increased my mental health over the Independence Day period when I spent the evening on the floor in Denver Airport.
Oh, gosh.
And then didn't even get water, let alone a hotel room. Anyhow,
Oh,
buys and buys. We love United Airlines. Look, mental health is going up in the roof. We've seen a definitive increase in people's psychological safety, their well-being, but more importantly, how we've seen mental health shoot up. Actually, IBEM has sponsored the Realize Foundation to really try and help and create impact in supporting people with mental health. But let's look at the toxic environment that you described. So we can start back 20 years ago when the issue of micromanagement was actually probably at its highest point. But it's not just toxic. Brent, we are talking about narcissism. We're seeing self-sabotaging executive leadership teams and CEOs because they just don't possess the competence or the skills or the foresights to be able to lead organizations in a more, as Karen said, a more open, transparent way. The whole idea of the trust paradigm is actually in the way we work, and it's the way we share. CEOs now should be more about open door policy, speaking with their employees, communicating more with their executive teams. And actually, it shouldn't be shameful for a chief executive officer. He or she should have the ability to be able to upskill and actually want to learn more and open their curriculum, outside curriculum, which is very much the way of the new modern leader. What we are seeing is, this is what I've been doing for the last 10 years. I'm going to continue. And this is the exit because I need my bonus. Well, they may not even get to their bonus, right? The fact is that boards of directors are governing heavily now, are putting accountability and responsibility into the eyes of the chief executive and his or her executive leadership team to execute on the new way of operating. And I'd like Douglas to come in now because we found in the past that business strategy was a solution. It's no longer a solution. It doesn't even band-aid the situation. We do know that we need to get it really into the roots of design-led thinking, the canvases that wrap itself around and get to the root of the cause of the problem and reinvention, because it's reinvention that's driving companies forward. So Doug, I think it's important at this trajectory point that you come in, because the issue then, because I think that what we've experienced in the last 3 years by the new product that we've got is very much that businesses will not just falter, they're likely to fail unless they take the right advice and they execute. We're not talking about words of hypothesis and theory. We're talking about real execution with measured performance results based on reinvention and not trying to just band-aid the situation. We all know that band-aid is not going to be enough in this vicious new era, new wave era, because there's more coming. There's absolutely more tsunamis on their way, and companies are just not prepared, just not ready for the consequences.
Yeah, thanks, Geoff. I think it's that whole analogy that says, we are in a world of very short-term performance-driven, I wouldn't call it micromanagement, but probably in some cases it is that detailed. And it's the ability to slow down to speed up. And it comes back to that, let's take technology right now. We know that AI is a massive hype cycle that we're going through. But the reality is we know that there's going to be more technologies down the line that's going to, have implications and opportunities for businesses. And so I think it's not to always be caught up in the moment, but it's the ability to see longer term. The one thing I've learned, and funny enough, the politicians actually taught me this. A really groomed politician thinks 30 to 50 years out. They don't think 5 years out, and it's quite a unique skill set. And so they have other different dynamics to play with, as Brent, you've alluded to. And I was enjoying the Biden-Trump rivalry on Fox News just now, but I think for me it's that ability to just get off the short-term operational treadmill and to have a view of the world that is actually just more progressive in terms of realizing, what I have, what I can do with it, and how I can unleash people when I just use their time more wisely and empower them. And it's that simple philosophy, Geoff, is that when you do that, when you get the combination of strategy and culture right, you light the flame in people's hearts versus under their butts. And I think that's the big difference where, as executive leaders, and it's also what Karen said, is that, we've always said strategy is the holy grail of the C-suite. Well, quite frankly, strategy needs to be inverted and actually be influenced by those who are with the clients in the front and listen to the clients every day. But equally, it's for leadership to create an environment that allows for this feedback, also to challenge the team in terms of new ways of thinking. And of course, wonderful systematic tools and all those kind of things, and design thinking that we all know and love really well, is using different approaches to the way that our people think. Just recently, Geoff and I had an opportunity to meet with a very senior managing executive of a global consulting firm, highly specialized in what they do. They're probably one of the most expensive consultants in the world in terms of their specialization. And I really found it progressive because the CEO is very successful, runs a large business globally, but he took the time to listen to us, to listen to our wisdom and experience, and really say, the number one thing I want to do is I want to open the minds of my senior leadership team. I want them to think differently. And I think, it'll be wonderful to engage with you on this topic. And I really don't see that often as executive leaders stopping and thinking and saying, how do I open the minds? How do I challenge the way my leadership team thinks and has perspective about the future? And that's, it was really uplifting to be in that conversation, but we're certainly not having enough of those conversations. We see the opposite extreme in a very operational, tactical approach.
I would like to add, Doug, Karen made a very valid point earlier. She said, look, chief exec's only prepared to give the HR director 30 minutes. I don't actually have a problem with the 30 minutes, providing that what's being discussed in that 30 minutes is smart, qualitative, to the point, and very valid, right? We had a chief executive who's actually got more air miles than Freddie Laker right now, frankly. He's flying everywhere. He really is maxed out. He's been in China, he's been in Hong Kong, he's been in India, and we know that he was coming back to the UK. He had limited bandwidth, but he said, look, this is my time. I'm giving you committed time. Can we get everything addressed within that day at your offices, at the workshop? And the answer was yes. So we basically do all the prepping around what needs to be addressed, using his time smartly and efficiently. And I don't have a problem with that, actually, but providing that you're not just talking about the weather and about your latest cable TV contract, that you're actually talking about the issues that need to be addressed. and the prioritization of that, and more importantly, an output plan that drives that execution. You know, there is a lot of wasted time in meetings. We already knew that before the pandemic, right? We knew there was a lot of wasted time. We knew that the purpose and the meaning of meetings during the pandemic and after the pandemic became, look, we're not just meeting for meeting's sake. We're meeting because A, B, C, D, and E. Okay, have you got everything you need? Fine. Okay. And so the purpose-driven organization became, you know, really important. Maybe you'd like Karen to bring you in at that point, right?
Yeah, I mean, we often, you know, for us, mission is a compelling vision, strategic direction, intent, and short-term goals and objectives. Most companies are quite comfortable in the short-term goals and objectives. Some will connect that to strategic priorities. Most really struggle to have a compelling vision, a clear purpose that's beyond stakeholder value, EBITDA. You know, a compelling purpose has to motivate every single person of that company to come to work because they understand the difference that company is trying to make. And I think most companies, in my experience, really struggle with the purpose bit. Yeah. You know, they'll do the strategy maybe. They're really clear on the short-term goals and objectives. But you know, that purpose connects to the empowerment piece on the involvement, and also the core values on the consistency bit. Yeah. What do we stand for? Why are we here? And why would I come to work to give you anything extra? Yeah. And I think, you know, I have kids in their 30s and they're refusing to work for companies that can't tell them that.
Well, let me ask you this, Karen. So let's say, in just a hypothetical example, you've got a company that makes pencils or steel, for example. In many cases, they would say, well, the purpose of our company is we need to make the best quality steel at the lowest possible cost and distribute it to the greatest degree of markets that we can and grow that way. But I agree with you in the sense that people have to have a reason to get up and go to work in the morning. How would you translate a company like that into the broader idea of, well, we're also involved in creating housing and transportation and things? Like, give me an idea how you change that mindset from just here's what we make.
You know, who's using the pencils?
Yeah.
And what are those pencils doing? And at the very least, if we can't find a greater purpose, then maybe we're making the lives of people who work here much better, because it's fairer, it's inspiring, we value people. There's always a purpose behind something, but you have to dig behind the real belief. You know, I'm a real, you know, Geoff talked about, you know, understanding how our brain works. You know, if we're thinking something and feeling something and therefore acting in a certain way, we can't ever change that unless we go back to what is the fundamental belief. And if the fundamental belief is to make more money so a small group of people can earn a lot of money and we'll do modern slavery for everybody else, people smell that really quickly, because that sometimes is the truth. So at the worst end of that truth, you can at least say, how do we make coming to work the best possible place that can be for the person that has to do that?
That's a tall order. And I would ask you all, the good thing I would imagine, and tell me if I'm wrong on this, is that any company that you're going to be moving into and beginning these discussions, they realize there's an issue that needs to be addressed anyway. So you've got a somewhat receptive audience, I guess. But where do you, I don't even know if this could be even too broad of a question, and whoever wants to dive in on it first, please do. But where do you even start in terms of trying to change that culture and adding a purpose to the organization as a whole?
Well, for me, I'll go on, Doug. Go on.
So, thanks, Karen. Yeah, I've actually lived through this, Brent, over a program of a decade with a CEO that came in and did a turnaround. The first thing is it has to be led by the CEO. So I get Geoff's 30-minute effective meetings. Absolutely, I agree with that. But there's much more than 30 minutes when it comes to leading a cultural change program. And it has to be led by the chief executive officer and his team, his or her team. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is you need to have a measurable tool that can measure the journey. Without measurement, it is very difficult to change, because you need to constantly communicate back to your contingent of staff on a regular basis. And so I was part of a program with a great professional in the US. His name is Richard Barrett, and I worked with Richard Barrett for 10 years on a transformational culture change program. And he has a very systematic approach to measuring personal culture, first of all, at an individual level, experience culture in the workplace versus desired workplace culture. And the difference between desired workplace culture and actual experience is what you would call entropy, which is an engineering term for the amount of dissonance in an organization. So, and that was a wonderful journey, because when we started to reduce the dissonance between what people wanted versus what they experienced, we saw performance, long-term performance improve. I think another lens, which is really, really powerful in terms of Karen's point around purpose, is that I'm a big believer in 3 horizon thinking, and I wrote a book on this, which has been published globally. And what we see is, when we look at 3 horizons of growth, and it's well known, is Horizon 1 is to grow the current business, Horizon 2 is to transform the current business, and Horizon 3 is to innovate brand new businesses. Now, they may come back into the mothership, or they may not, depending on the nature and the size. And we see most executive teams around the world tend to spend, I would say, 90% of their time, or 85% of their time, in run the business. Because why? They incentivize on 12-month performance cycles. They then dabble in transformation, which is, and I would call digitizing a client process is merely transformation. It is not innovation. As much as many people think it's innovation, it's not. Innovation is creating new products, new markets, with using your core assets and capabilities. And so it comes back to the example of the pencil that says, well, if we manufacture pencils, what is our core capability? Our core capability, yes, we manufacture pencils, but actually we have the ability to manufacture volume products, low value, high volume at scale, and that's a core capability. I look at institutions like financial institutions and say, well, you have financial strength, you have an awesome customer base, but what do you do with it? All you do is you just digitize their current experiences and you try to outperform each other. And so it comes back to this vision, the longer term vision of 3 horizon thinking, and really bringing about a culture of working in the business versus working on the business, and actually having that at all levels in the organization. And it's that, I think when we opened up, we talked about psychological safety and vulnerability, to allow that to be part of the DNA of your business. And I think, in my experience, when we've seen that type of philosophy be appreciated and led from the top, coupled with a strong culture and a measurement tool by the CEO and his or her executive team, we really see outperformance in long-term outperformance.
I think. Sorry, Karen, please go ahead.
No. I just kind of going to iterate that, actually having a measurement that differentiates, because you'll not have one culture in the business. If you can segment it, you can begin to have a much more coherent discussion. I think we don't make culture very tangible, so it makes that conversation much harder to have. Whatever measure we're using, then I think we should start to define what we mean by that, to measure it, and once there's data on the table, the conversation can begin to evolve, particularly if you've done some work around the climate and the cohesiveness of the team that's discussing the data.
Now, Karen, how
I think we got a bit of a. I'm going to throw a curveball in here, because there is. I like curveballs.
Yeah.
So,
we know.
I think we've got to have a curveball, because it's not the CEO who owns strategy, right? Number one, it's actually the board. Okay, the board own strategy and they own governance. They actually own the ESG agenda. They actually own the cybersecurity agenda. They actually own many things. And now the new trust agenda is being driven by board. So in actual fact, yes, from an operational level, the CEO with his executive leadership, his or her executive leadership, fine. But it's the board that defines, what the charter is for that area of the operation, right? Overall. So yes, strategy, understand that. Actually, culture is very important. Ownership comes from the board down. So yeah, we start to get our hands dirty on the operations, I've got no problem with saying that the CEO has ownership, but actually the board govern, the board run, and the board write the charters which effectively the company need to adhere to. And there are subcommittees, there should be subcommittees around audit, risk, people now, because now we've got a chief people officer, as you know, on the board, on a lot of boards. You've got a technical committee, and then you've got cyber, which goes into technical theoretically, but now you've got trust, which sort of and risk committee, which risk comes out of audit, but so most of the main decisions that are being made are made by senior board directors. Now you've got to question whether that he or she that sit on the board have the relevant skill sets to manage the charters.
Or Geoff, and I think you bring up a great point. And in many cases, the board members they're from outside the organization, and they may have very different agendas. I know that obviously, big one here in the United States with Vanguard and BlackRock and State Street in terms of putting their agendas on companies that may be in very different businesses, and they're supportive of for a variety of reasons. So how do you now, I think you bring up a great point there, and I'll put this to you all, I guess, individually, because the boards do have so much power, as you've laid out, Geoff, how do you try to get everyone on the same page when you might have a lot of different agendas across those board members?
So I've been a board member, as you know, for 15 years. So I've served in that time around 7 companies around various industries. And it's been really interesting because many a time, you can be putting your proposal of approach forward to the executive leadership team, the CEO. But if they don't know how to have a seat at the board or communicate, more importantly, to the board, and we've seen this time and time again, where people come in with this 80-page proposal and the board need 1-page bullet points and cost, and they don't get it. And therefore, the proposal will never go forward. Many of the proposals for transformation and change, and also more importantly, the risk side of things, have failed because of an inability to communicate correctly with the board. And irrespective of whether they're observer seats or whether they're executive board seats, these people hold the authority for those various committees. You'll generally have a chairman. Like, for instance, I'm chairman of the Remco committee on 2 of the companies that I serve on at the moment, as an example. So there's nothing really that's going to happen around finance or audit without my knowledge and without my sanction. So it's very important that we understand that there is a shift that also needs to take place on a board. Douglas and I are working on a project at the moment. We've got a series of gentlemen over the age of 80, sitting on the board. But they don't understand, the changes in the world, in the market enough. They really want lunch and to do lunch and to tinker around the spreadsheet, right? But they don't have the level of competence in a fast changing, moving, disruptive world that we're currently working within to comprehend that change. So therefore, it's additional work by the CEO. He or she has got to spend around the education. But as I said before, the bigger issue is communicating with the board, from whether you're internal or whether you're external, trying to make change around transformation on some of the topics that we've just described is very difficult, because unless you're embedded. So for instance, we understood that HR there was a big question around what is the value that HR is bringing. So purpose and people and well-being and all those good things came under the chief people officer. So that person had a seat at the board, right? So because HR directors were not being heard, and it's quite a fact that unless you're heard at the board and you're able to communicate effectively with the board, things are not going to take place. Very fundamentally, irrespective of doing a small project and hopefully leading to a larger project. No, the board have to sanction the sign-off, right? Has to be approved by board.
Douglas, what would you have to say about that?
I absolutely agree with Jeff's comments, and I've got maybe additive views to that. Is first of all, I think the role of the CEO is now a much more complex role in terms of stakeholder management. And the board is just one set of stakeholders. I think we are entering into a world of regulators, community stakeholders in which organization operates in, et cetera, et cetera. And so this, as we know, it's a lonely position. But I think the positive thing on boards is for CEOs to embrace board members who don't necessarily have what I call dominant industry logic. And the reason why I say that is because we know that the number one the one thing that really prevents innovation in any organization is an over-reliance on industry logic. So take, for example, the executive recruitment market in the world. So you would find that anybody who wants to recruit at C-suite level will want a pedigree executive from within that industry. But I really challenge that to say, well, why? Because sometimes having an executive from another industry with different skills and abilities can actually elicit new ways of thinking. And so I have the same view with board members, and many times board members will not have the infamous dominant industry logic. And so it's, again, how you manage the board members in terms of the value that they can bring to the organization. But more importantly, is how do you tell a composite story as the CEO to get everybody aligned, and it's not a function of trying to herd cats. To do that, again, comes back to a very clear vision, purpose that Karen spoke of, a very clear long-term plan that goes beyond horizon 1 and 2, but into that horizon 3, organizational thinking. And so, and it's also that ability to, simply put, because trust is really around just spending quality time asking questions, really deeply refined questions of whether it be a board member, whether it be a regulator, and listening carefully. Because when you listen carefully, you really get the insights that you seek. So I do believe that, again, that philosophy of slowing down to speed up, having a very mindfulness approach to how you build these unique relationships, and that actually ultimately you want the board to be stronger as a whole versus the individual components. And I think there's an art and a science to that, which in some cases may be more challenging than others, but it's certainly, something I fundamentally believe is a great opportunity space.
I think that, a lot of it comes down again to creating that compelling vision. And Karen, I think I'd like to ask you this. If you're dealing with somebody or an organization where they're stuck in the day-to-day stuff, where's the first place that they can start, or leadership can start, to begin to craft that compelling vision that's going to bring the rest of the people on board?
For the leadership team, for me, it starts actually in the top leadership team, because often their level of conversation and dialogue is uninspiring. So it starts at the core values level. Often when we do a culture diagnostic, the senior leaders will say, oh yeah, we're really clear about the core values, we hold people to account. Everybody else says absolutely not. So it starts on a very personal journey. But how are they showing up with each other? What is their purpose for being in this leadership team? And often, I ended a leadership team the other week, and I asked each leader to think about what their contribution to their team was, and what they would like to ask of the team. And every single leader, apart from the CEO and the HR director, thought about the team that they were leading rather than the leadership team that they just spent 2 days thinking about the core values in. And that's part of the challenge. Which team are we talking about? And, most leadership teams, in my experience, until you make them more cohesive, are a group of leaders, not a leadership team. So we talk about coordination and integration, within consistency. Really high performing organizations, individual leaders give up something because it's best for the business as a whole. Culture is about the collective. There is no room for I in culture. It's about the we. So I would start by being really clear, what's the purpose from that leadership team about why they think they exist, and what difference are they trying to make as a leadership team?
Now, I'd like to ask you each this individually. Is Give me an example of a really great success story where you have come in and helped these organizations establish or reestablish this trust, because trust is very easy. It's very easy to destroy. You can do that very quickly, and it can be a single action and event. It takes a very long time to build up. So I guess, Geoff, I'll start with you. Can you share an example with me where you've really
Yeah,
been
I
able to
can show
profoundly
an
change?
example. I can show an example. It's an example that I'm very proud of. It's a company in Europe that was only, sort of turnover wise, about 7 million, roughly 5 to 7 million. When I went in, it was an absolute mess. The company was a mess. We had 12 offices in Europe. We had partnership in Russia, Middle East, and Africa. I had to do a SWOT analysis of the whole business, of the 12 offices, which I did. I then flew back to New York to get the money. And once I got the money, and I said to my boss very clearly, happily do the speed of this transformation, but I do not want to be micromanaged. I report to you daily, and I will fly monthly to sit down with you across everything that I'm making significant change on. And so we sustained a vertical of the existence while I was doing the change from underneath. And then once I launched, I fixed all the problems in the organization, from headquarters to manufacturing to all the countries. And then I've reset the sales machine, the customer service machine, the manufacturing machine, and the distribution machine. And then I took that business to 250 million plus in just over 2.5 years. So that was an example. Now, how did I make that work? A couple of things. It wasn't just about, some of it was joining the dots out. Some of it was strategy. It was the composition of the people that I brought in for the transformation that made a big difference. Taking people from a product bias to a solution bias, a lot of them didn't make the grade. So I had to replace those people in the various countries, open up new offices, re-KPI'd it, and then obviously new products, and then drove significant performance with existing and with new. So that was it. But trust became a big part of it, and culture was a massive part, because I'm dealing with multilingual culture. And I remember my chap in Portugal saying, Geoff, you haven't just created a new culture, you've created a new religion. I had bigger percentage of buy-in to, employee emotional side of things, driving better performance, not wanting to leave, actually passion and commitment to driving. And of course, that was all performance driven and metrics driven. But I think the intelligences were there. So yeah, we had the IQ. Sure, we had a bigger, stronger area of emotional intelligence, but we did have decency intelligence. We did have spiritual intelligence. We had wisdom. We had knowledge, knowledge share, a lot of new initiatives, a lot of work. But it was so worthwhile. Yeah, it was really worthwhile. So that's one of many, but probably the most significant for this conversation.
And Karen, how about you? Do you have a great example to share with us?
Yeah, I did some. There was a company that had acquired lots of different businesses, and we had 20 general managers in a room who had been at war. They hadn't been talking. They'd been business owners who have now been acquired, and they hadn't kind of really they hadn't gelled. So we had 2 days in the room with them using peer coaching, where they were standing up. We did a leadership assessment. They were standing up, presenting their own assessment, and in small groups, really being courageous about having a different type of discussion. We were kind of coaching them. So they'd spent 2 days doing that. And then actually at the end of those 2 days, one of the very contentious general managers who'd been behaving very badly, when we again offered them to say, what's this network of general managers mean to you now? He stood up and apologized. And he said, actually, I have to offer an apology. I've been arrogant, I've been rude, I've been disrespectful, and actually I haven't been thinking about what the larger holding company can can offer, what I can offer to them. I've just been thinking about what I can take from them. And that created a whole different cross-fertilized atmosphere. So they were open, they were courageous, they had a different kind of conversation. And actually the peer coaching carried on every week after the event, the 2-day event. So it set up a different relationship. It enabled, they chose to be vulnerable, and there were public apologies, which
Wow, that's pretty powerful.
Yeah.
And Douglas, how about you?
Yeah, one that resonates really strongly with me was it was actually an executive sponsor role on a big collaboration program spanning 22,000 staff and 6 million customers. I came into a project which was looking to extract value across various business units, and they were very much siloed and in some cases competitive against each other. The revenue at that point was 14 billion on those combined businesses. And the executive leader who was running the program really was a micromanager and instilled fear. And the project was absolutely failing in every endeavor. And I took over, and the first thing I did was I really looked at the team that was there. I handpicked, some team members. I didn't get rid of too many. Thankfully, they were good people. They just were misguided and led incorrectly. And so, first of all, I just instilled the passion in the hearts of my direct team that was responsible for this program and the execution of this program. I listened carefully. I listened to what they had to say, what their views and perspectives were, and how we should run the program. And then collectively, we started a rejuvenation of the program and communicating across 22,000 people. Similar to Karen, we had coaching environments where we created coaches in each of the divisional businesses and geographical businesses. So it was coach the coach. And it was quite interesting that Geoff mentioned cultures. There were certain locations I had to dress in some way very formal, and some locations it was very informal. And so you had to apply what I call contextual leadership in going to where your teams are. Don't expect them to always come to you. And we had fun, and we built an environment where we said, listen, we haven't got this right. We were honest, we were vulnerable. I certainly showed vulnerability with my team, and we rebuilt it. We rebuilt the culture of collaboration and trust amongst 22,000 people. And the success of that journey was never about me or even my team. It was about, doing amazing things in the communities that our businesses operated in, seeing the tangible difference where we made. And we took our revenue from 14 billion to 18 billion in 2 years. And so it just shows you when you unleash, and it comes back to that greater purpose. Because what we did was we had a very clear vision and a purpose of why we were doing this. It wasn't just to make profit and increase revenue. We actually wanted to make a difference in the communities that we operated in. Some of them were quite impoverished, and it was a long-term journey. And when we unleashed this amongst the teams and the teams on the ground, they came up with all the ideas. They came up with the ideas because it was localized. It was contextual. I could never think of those. And so for me, it was lighting the flames in the hearts of layers of leadership teams, which culminated in huge celebration and success. And we celebrated every success. We built in a wonderful digital marketing tool internally where everybody could have a say. We could celebrate success. So it was a wonderful journey. It eventually, I had 2 professors write a business case, which was published globally on it. But it was just about me steering a team. It was the team and the teams of the teams on the ground that really unleashed it. And that's what I think happens at leadership level. If you can unlock that greatness and that trust and the belief, most importantly, the belief that you can achieve anything, people will amaze you.
And Douglas, I think that's a phenomenal way to wrap us up here. And Geoff, I'll pose one last question to you: is if people want to reach out, you all have done an enormous number of things individually. We could spend the next 30 minutes going over the books you've all written and your bios and everything. But Geoff, if people want to reach out to you and explore this in greater detail, how you could possibly help their organization, where do they start?
Well, I'll leave that one to Douglas. But I think, I'm looking forward to having lunch with you in Phoenix.
That's right. We'll see each other in a few
Surely,
months.
so I'm looking forward to that. I think, look, I think most people know how to get hold of me, and I'm online. I think what I'd like to leave this discussion with is that I think, I want viewers to understand, please do not underestimate the market condition or the challenges that we're all coming up against, both politically, in business, and in our own one-to-one relationships. I think that to respond to this strategically, to these economic events and other events, and even to the point where when I was being interviewed on television, on the news, it was about female gender and trust in public opinion, and so therefore to deal with this is going to take a high degree of creativity to overcome these challenges and these assumptions, and willingness to look certainly beyond the obvious, right, to address the threats that we've got coming in. And I talked about this tsunami, but I think that all untold, and we can get through this, and there are these threats turn into opportunities, because there's always the two sides of this, right? But I go back to trust, and I think that everything we've discussed on this call today is about, as far as I'm concerned, I describe it as a trust genesis. So what do I mean by that? I think we all got to start thinking about a self-awareness, but self-trust in the dynamics, right? Relationship trust has never been more important in everything we do. Survival of the fittest is about the relationship. And then from relationship, organizational trust, right? Within, we talked about, how do we get a seat at the board? How do we communicate with the board? Well, trust is a big measure in the ability to be able to speak, right? And then, of course, if you can create self-trust, relationship trust, organizational trust, we will lead into market trust. And my ultimate goal for the world is societal trust, right? Because each and every one of us, that openness that Karen talked about, that sharing and transparency and ability to be open, right? The heart can be open, and we can start communicating, listening, understanding, and communicating. So one of my big things in life is to try and create that awareness in the world, because we can deal with mental health, we can deal with issues, but we need a foundation of trust. And to me, that is the glue. Right.
Completely agree. And we will have in a link to this episode, we'll have contact information for all of you. And I really want to thank you all. I know logistically we're in different parts of the world. We had a lot of different time zones that we had to try to coordinate this with. And I think it was an awesome discussion. And Geoff, I know we'll see each other soon. And
yeah, I'm excited to see you, Brent.
Really great. Really feel grateful for the opportunity to talk to you all about this today. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brent.
Thank you.
Well, Brent, that was an absolutely fascinating conversation, because I don't think there are two more important issues that you could be talking about today than the issues of trust and the issues of leadership. And I really want to thank you for bringing this discussion to us, and of course your guest as well. Just a great conversation.
Yeah, thank you all. And again, I'm just really glad we got this done today. So thanks, everyone.
Brent,
Right.
Thanks, Brent. Take care, everybody.
And thank
Bye.
you, Brent.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. And thank you, listeners, for listening to this podcast, Smart Money Simplified. If you're a new listener and you like what you heard, hit the subscribe button. That way, every episode will be delivered directly to you and you won't miss an episode. We also humbly ask that you rate and share this podcast. And doing so, you will help others learn about it. I'm Bill Tucker. On behalf of Brent Mekosh and MP Partner Advisors, thanks again for listening. Until next time. Wow.